We'll pick up. Hopefully I'm recovered enough that I can take over. Thank Mark and Gary for pitch hitting in the early going. All right, we're going to pick up on contract management, and we're going to start with a simple example and then extrapolate from a simple example and into more complex examples. But we'll start with a simple one just to show you the basic elements. And supposedly this afternoon, all that will stop popping up again, but it'll keep happening until this afternoon. And the thing to emphasize is, even though the steps are the same, if you have a more complex procurement, then you're going to have more elements and more complexity involved, but it still distills to the same basic elements. So we're going to start with a simple example. Simple example, buying the traditional widgets. You've heard widgets is the standard for everything that you want to give an example. So we're going to buy 12 widgets, and a purchase order is issued for 12 widgets to be delivered to a specific agency location at a specific time. And they are ordered via purchase order. And in this instance, a purchase order is a contract. And a lot of people at times ask me about, is a purchase order a contract? And the answer is yes, a purchase order is a contract. So that is a constant. With the state, you need some kind of written documentation to evidence a contract. In most instances, it will be a purchase order, a formal contract, etc. But even if it's a small procurement for a couple $100, you need some kind of a receipt or something to evidence something in writing that there was a contract of a nature. So here, a purchase order is a contract. And the deliverables for this simple example are the 12 widgets, not 13, not 11, 12, that they are of an acceptable quality level, and they are to be delivered where the purchase order said to deliver them, not in York, Pennsylvania, not in Washington, D.C., not in budget and management, but if the order was to be delivered at the loading dock 201 West Preston Street, that's where the order was delivered. And the other thing, you want to make sure that the price that is charged by the vendor on the invoice is the same as they quoted for when you got a quote from them, that they're not charging something different even if everything else is as ordered. So those are the elements we're looking at contract management here. So what happens is the agency provides a copy of the purchase order, which again is the contract, to the receiving department, and in this instance, the person in the receiving department at the loading dock is the initial contract manager. We would not think of that, but this person is the contract manager because this person is doing the job of verifying if what is received matches up with what is on the purchase order. So the contract manager, otherwise known as the receiving officer, will check the purchase order to, number one, make sure that he or she has a purchase order for what comes in, because every now and then something might be received and you have no purchase order, so you don't know that anyone actually ordered it. So you will not receive something if you don't have a purchase order to match up with it. And assuming that the person finds the purchase order, then they verify the elements. Was it delivered at the place indicated? It occurred particularly within the time frame. Did it come sooner than was expected? Did it come later than it was expected, than was specified? Because if it's sooner, it may mean that there's no one ready to handle it. They have no one that can store it. It's not ready to be used. And you have a longer period of time. It might spoil or something before you actually use it. So if it's sooner, then it is a deviation from the contract requirement. So the question is that acceptable if it's sooner? Sometimes you will readily think if you get something sooner than you specified, that's okay. And sometimes it might be, and sometimes it might not be. So someone has to verify whether sooner is okay. Later than okay. Is that okay? Lots of times if it's later than okay, we either went out and got what we needed by alternative means, so we don't need it anymore, or sometimes we simply did without. So if timing is not as specified, someone has to verify, the receiving clerk has to verify whether it is okay to still receive it outside the parameters of the purchase order. Check to see that it's widgets. It's not bowling balls or vaccines or anything else. It is widgets. And was it 12 widgets? Is it 12 that came in, not 11, 13, etc.? And assuming that it's not something that is hidden, that you can't open, then open the package, verify that yes, they're widgets, and they're widgets that comply with the qualitative standards. Qualitative standards meaning they're not broken. If we specified a color, they are that color. If we specified a size, they are that size. And anything else we specify, they conform to it. So that is what the receiving clerk is going to do in the role of the contract manager. And if there's any deviation, what that person is not supposed to do is necessarily accept it, but go to the people that placed the order to see whether those deviation is acceptable. If they are, then you have a modification to the purchase order that must be done. You must change the purchase order so that now the deviation is within the confines of the purchase order. It's now acceptable, i.e. there's a contract modification. If the deviation is not acceptable, the receiving clerk will reject the order and thus will not authorize payment for the order. So a simple example. From the simple example just presented, we will extract the contract management elements that should apply to any contract, big or small, simple or complex. The core elements of contract management are the same for a complex contract as a simple contract. The elements are the same. You just have more of them, and they're more complex, but they still distill to the same core elements, which is what the last point says. And here's the core elements. Someone is to be a contract manager. In the example we just gave, the receiving clerk was the contract manager. And the contract manager is supposed to verify these circumstances, that there is a contract, because there is not supposed to be receipt of goods, there's not supposed to be payment for goods unless there's a contract authorizing it. Because if to do otherwise might mean that vendors are sending things in and getting paid for things that we never asked for, we didn't want, and we shouldn't be paying for things we didn't order. That's simple. Plus, there are controls in place. Contracts have to be in existence. They can't be expired. They have to be approved, and you want to make sure all that has happened. So you want to make sure a contract is in place. That from the contract, using the contract as the source document, what are the deliverables? What is it that is supposed to be provided by the contractor? So you have to ascertain those. When the contractor says that he or she has completed the deliverables, one of them, some of them, all of them, then they're going to come to the state and they're going to want payment. And so, again, you have to look at what the deliverable was, and then you're going to have to determine whether it was properly provided. Just because the vendor says, I'm done, I have done the work I have contracted to do, doesn't mean they necessarily have. Someone has to look and has to verify that it has been completed as specified. And then, if it has been, then you get the invoice, and you make sure the invoice is for the price that supposedly was agreed to for the proper completion of each and every deliverable. And if it isn't, we have an issue there just with the invoicing. And if it is, everything is proper, then there's an approval of payment. So these are the basic elements, very simple. And if performance deviates from the requirements, contract manager notifies the contractor of the deviation. Notifies the contractor of the deviation. Sometimes the contractor should know it. Sometimes if it's simply shipped in and then there's an invoice that comes in, the people doing the invoice may not know whether what was shipped was correct or not correct. So you need to let the contractor know if there's a deviation. And again, if the deviation is acceptable, you need to do a formal modification to allow it to be acceptable, otherwise you reject and don't pay. You do not authorize payment for anything that does not satisfy contract requirements, this point, and this is key. Anything you do, you document. That is a very fundamental issue of contract management. You have to document each and every element so that if there's any question in the future, if the auditors come in to audit, or anything happens, if someone replaces you as contract manager, someone needs to be able to go back in the contract management file and find documentation of what has happened before, and in particular, if you have modified the contract, there needs to be evidence in there that you have done that and have done that properly, so that now is what the contract calls for. The modified version, not the original version. Has to be in there, or otherwise there's going to be problems. So if you have more involved contracts, excuse me, instead of 3 deliverables, right quantity, right quality, timeliness, there may be dozens or even hundreds of deliverables, but the same 3 aspects always apply. Do you have the right quantity? Do you have the right quality? And is it at the right time? Quality, quantity, timeliness. That's going to come up over and over and over. So that's what you're looking for, and it may be on dozens of things that you're verifying quality, quantity, and timeliness on each and every one of them before you authorize payment. But for each of these aspects, it may be much harder to determine if they have been performed. And that's the whole issue, knowing whether they have been performed. And it may not be obvious. So the first organizational steps, talking about contract management, is to create the contract management plan. We will do some more details to the contract management plan later, but basically, when you are planning, at the planning stage of a procurement, you're going to plan elements of this nature. How are you going to manage the contract? And that is the contract management plan. It starts off with, in advance, certain elements involved in the contract management. And then as you go through the procurement, it may change. And then once the contract is awarded, then the actual management, everything that happens should be in this contract management plan and contract management file. Second step after you have the plan is to list the deliverables, each and every deliverable, and their characteristics, again, going to quantity, quality, and timeliness. And you do this by typically creating the contract compliance checklist. This is something that was mentioned before. And this is something that when we get to slide 176, and as Mark has already said, the emphasis here is that you create this in advance and at the planning stage before you even do a procurement. And that helps you 2 ways. Number one, it helps you focus on what your deliverables are. If you have to do a checklist to identify the deliverables, then obviously you'll take great effort to identify the deliverables so that you can put them in a checklist. And it's kind of like a check and balance. And we're going to have an example probably on the second day where we're going to give you a procurement, an actual procurement that was done, and ask you to create a contract compliance checklist for those specifications. And when I say check and balance, sometimes when you have to go ahead and construct this checklist, you come up with this situation of, I can't tell. And obviously that's a very bad result if you're trying to do a checklist to determine what the deliverables are, and you cannot tell from your specifications what the deliverables even are. What means that you have to go and re-examine and rewrite and do something so that you can tell what your deliverables are. And then once you have done that and have this in a document, the suggestion is that you include that document in your specifications as an attachment so the vendors can see that you have taken the effort to complete this checklist. They can see that you have exerted that effort to at least list them as far as what the deliverables are, what the timeframes are, things of this nature. And that kind of goes more than halfway towards convincing a vendor that you're going to manage the contract. If there's a document in the solicitation that says, here's what has to be done at various times, etc., so that everyone who is potentially going to bid on this can see that this has been structured already, they're going to make the assumption that you're going to manage the contract. And that's half of the battle for the vendors to believe you're going to do it. So do the contract compliance checklist. The third step, and we're going to take a little bit of time on this, is to determine what action is needed to ascertain compliance with each deliverable. Actions that typically need to be built in at the solicitation stage in advance. We're going to get into the issue of contract monitoring. And we're going to break contract monitoring into two types of aspects, active and passive. Active monitoring, passive monitoring. We're going to explain examples of each type and what they get for you and why you use one versus the other, the characteristics of these. So each means or tool for monitoring contract compliance is going to be either an active tool or a passive tool. And depending upon the contract that you have, the deliverables you have, either one might be appropriate in various circumstances. And we're going to talk about these. Active monitoring requires someone or some entity to provide or do something that indicates the contractor's performance or stage of contract completion. Somebody has to actually do something as a positive action. And that somebody can be the contractor, can be the agency, or can be some other entity that you have contracted with or you have obtained in some other fashion who's going to do something. And we'll talk about these somethings probably in about 2 slides. Active monitoring is most appropriate for major contracts when proper performance is very important. The more complex, the more valuable, the more essential it is this be done correctly, the more likely that your monitoring techniques will be an active technique, where someone is going out and actually investigating or determining the stage of completion or whether completion has occurred. Dynamic contracts with progressive deliverables or deliverables that change over time. These are the ones that are most suited to active monitoring. Excuse me. Passive monitoring essentially means the vendor is basically by default, unless we have some other evidence to the contrary, we will assume they're doing an okay job. And passive monitoring, things like complaints or surveys, these are after the fact sort of, but these are the type of passive monitoring, and they are most appropriate for contracts with less importance, more static or repetitive, or you have a couple other issues looking at this. And another thing we're going to say in just another slide is it depends a great deal on the target audience of a contract. Who is going to receive the benefit of a contract? If it's something that's directly going to the state and one person can verify whether performance is being achieved, then you typically don't need a passive type of monitoring. If it's something that is going to the general public, if you are delivering, I have to think, well, if someone's riding the subway system and you want to find out whether the public is satisfied with the subway system, then typically you're going to do things like surveys or monitor complaints. These are passive type of monitoring. You can't have the public give you weekly reports because the public is thousands of people. So you have to rely upon other means if the end result is for a large number of users versus a single user, etc. So I'm going to get on that in another slide. As a corollary to the importance or dynamicism of the contract, the basic difference between active or passive means frequently is cost. Frequently, active monitoring costs more than passive monitoring. The fact that someone has to do something typically has a cost associated by, well, no one has to do anything, we'll just see whether there's a complaint, and if there's a complaint, we'll handle the complaint. Very different situation. Generally, active monitoring tools cost more than passive tools because the contractor increases its price to accommodate the required monitoring tool. Expenses occurred for a different contractor to provide monitoring or agency personnel. These are the reasons why you typically have more cost for active monitoring, because somebody has to do something. Time is money. And it is more appropriate to incur additional costs for major contracts. Another key element, and this is what I just started talking about, to choosing the type of contract monitoring is the target audience. Contracts to serve the public or a large number of end users, even within an agency. If you have an IT contract, and the IT contractor is supposed to provide computer support for 8,000 people in the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, what do you get, 8,000 reports? Does every person in DHMH report on a monthly basis their satisfaction with the vendor? The answer is no. So probably what you'll do is look at, are there complaints? And you will have standards for what is appropriate for complaints to measure whether a vendor is performing. You will have a standard that says this is an okay number of complaints, this is an excessive level of complaints. And the more complaints, then by extension, the worse the vendor is doing. Fewer complaints, presumption, the better the contractor is doing. So that's just an illustration. But even with complaints, and again, passive can be complaints, surveys, focus groups. All of those are categorized as types of passive monitoring tools. But even with complaints, to show you that even a passive tool can be an expensive tool, assuming that you have the situation where something is targeted to the general public and you want to have a complaint mechanism, that you can have procedures to advertise the complaint mechanism. You can put it on television, radio, billboards, handouts, that if you have a complaint, call this number. And you can have a complaint resolution center that is specified, a call center, so that people can call in with their complaints. So that you can, even with a passive type of monitoring, have an expensive situation to make sure that monitoring is in place. The essence is monitoring. Some monitoring tool is in place for each deliverable. So here are the typical passive types of monitoring tools. The most passive, I guess, is observation. If there's a contract to clean the floors and you're working in the building where the floor is to be cleaned, you can walk down the floor and walk down the hall, look at the floor, and you can make your own judgment as to whether it's clean. So all you have to do is look, and you can see it seemingly has happened or it seemingly is not happening. So it's a casual observation. Complaints we've talked about. Focus groups. If you're serving thousands of customers, you can have 2, 3, 4 focus groups of appropriately selected people and have their comments be representative of the comments of thousands of people if you have selected them properly in a scientific manner. And if you have someone who is skilled with focus groups and how to elicit the comments and reactions of people, you can get a lot of benefit. So that's one thing that can be specified. Or satisfaction surveys, that probably most of you have the health contracts through Care First or Aetna or Mamsie, one of these people. There are satisfaction surveys that go to people every year, that the state employees, to try to measure their satisfaction with the health providers. And based upon the results, whether 85% of people are satisfied, 90, 95, etc., that indicates the job they're doing. So we use surveys of customer satisfaction for the health benefits plans. And there can be other, but these are the things that are most readily used for passive. Active, and these are the other things. A report. Vendor has to do a report weekly or monthly or quarterly, and the report has to identify certain information. To tell, they have to prepare it, and they have to have this information to let you know whether, from their standpoint, they're identifying they are achieving what they're supposed to achieve. You can have meetings to do the same thing, or it can be a combination of meetings and reports, so that there you have an actual situation with people involved in discussing performance or non-performance and things to do about it. You can have inspections, either by state personnel or personnel of other contractors, who will actually go in and do a formal inspection of performance to ascertain whether the vendor's doing what they're supposed to. If it's something that does not lend itself to inspections, an audit is the same thing. Financial records or various things that they're doing. Sometimes we will get a vendor go in to audit a vendor's performance. The legislative auditors many times will do some kind of auditing of vendor's performance. And if it's not being done as specified, they will write up the agency for having contractors being paid for not doing what they're supposed to do. So audit situation. Occasionally, depending on whether it's a tangible item, you might have laboratory tests that tell you whether it's being done. You might have sampling, random sampling, statistical sampling that indicates whether performance is happening. You can have an outside firm that is specifically hired to do nothing but oversee a vendor's performance, as Mark has said, because they typically might have more skills, more time, more focused ability to do management than perhaps we in the state. So these are the kind of things that you have to look at in the beginning. How am I going to monitor the contractor's performance? And you may likely have a mixture of these things. If you have a complex contract, you may have some elements that are monitored by passive means. You may have some elements that are monitored by active means. You need to think, and you need to put these in your specifications so vendors know they're supposed to do it and they can include it in their price. That is very crucial, because one of the reasons why vendors have performance issues is because they find out they are supposed to do something that they didn't anticipate and didn't build into their price. And vendors want to make money. You know, there's no secret about that. And so if they found they missed the mark and they are not making money or not making as much as they anticipated, frequently they're going to try and skimp, and they're going to try and see what they can get away with. So the better that you have done the planning process, the better you have done the procurement process, helps in the contract monitoring process. So those are the things that have to be in place. All right, going back to the whole issue of what you need to look at. Determine, so you're in the planning stage of how do you monitor a contract. Now we've determined the monitoring activity. Now we have to determine who is going to be doing the monitoring. Who is going to be that contract manager for the state? Or are we going to get someone from an outside firm? Will we need multiple people? Sometimes for very major projects, you may have to go out and hire people. You may have to hire state employees so that they'll be in place for the next 5 years to be able to monitor something that is a very complex undertaking. And if that's what you have to do, you have to know this in advance so that you can go and hire the people and get them trained and get them in place before you do a procurement to have a vendor start working. So you have to know what pieces go first. And you have to schedule things of this nature. You may have to do a procurement to get a vendor to help you in some aspect. And if you have to do a procurement first, that's something that has to happen before you go to manage a contract if you have to have another vendor in place. So the steps that we talked about, 4, 5, and 6, are part of project management. And that's for the interaction between project management and contract management. You need to have the project management in place to assist with contract management. In other words, the monitoring of the contract may itself be a major undertaking. The monitoring may itself be a major undertaking. And so you have to pay attention to the monitoring tools. Much more, it may be much more than a full-time or part-time involvement in one person. And one of the things that we will emphasize is, aside from the state creating a contract management plan, we should have vendors create a contract management plan so we can see how they intend to manage their own contract, what resources they will put in place, what time frames, so that we can monitor not only our plan, but in particular their plan, and see that they're following their plan. So that's a requirement in our specifications that will help us monitoring later by requiring a vendor to do its own contract management plan. And what we will emphasize is that if you have an evaluated procurement, the vendor's contract management plan should be part of what you evaluate. You want to see, at least on a draft basis, how the vendor is scoping out their intent to manage the project. That will show you the resources they will apply to it, seemingly whether they seem to understand what they're supposed to be doing, seemingly whether they understand the time frame they're supposed to be achieving, and whether everything seems to be in place, versus a vendor that gives you a plan that doesn't say anything and doesn't give you a lot of confidence they either understand or intend to really manage very well. And if it's an evaluated procurement, that can be part of the decision of what vendor you select. Even if it's not an evaluated procurement, you can require this after the award of a contract that the vendor has to give you a contract management plan. So if it's a sealed bid procurement where it's not an evaluative factor, you can still say within X days of the start of the contract, either before, typically before, sometimes after, you will want a contract management plan from the vendor that you will have the ability to review, approve, disapprove, require them to change, all from the standpoint of knowing whether the vendor is applying the proper resources to manage. And let's see, everything mentioned on this in the 10 prior slides will be part of the contract management file. All the stuff we're talking about is in your file to document. Let's see, because of the possible lead time needed for some action, hiring staff, procurement, etc., by doing the contract management plan, it might be realized the contract management elements may need to be put in place before the contract to be managed is awarded. So if you need to do something 2 years in advance, you need to do it 2 years in advance. If you didn't know that until you went to do a procurement, then you're going to delay the project by 2 years because you just realized something else has to happen first. And this is an example we used in the planning class, but this is back in 1999 when the state intended to do what was called a personnel benefits information system. And it was a very complex situation that in the planning we talk about that was estimated to be at least $70 million and very possibly more than $70 million. And what it was determined that to do this procurement to get a new project personnel benefits information system, that we had to do a procurement to get a vendor to go out to all the state agencies and determine what personnel systems, what benefits systems, what information technology systems they had in place, what their business roles were, and on the basis of taking about 6 months to go to 60-some different agencies to go in and identify all the in-place IT systems for this activity, then the vendor was supposed to come up with recommendations for what a new statewide personnel benefits information system was to look like, and the vendor was to do the survey and the analysis, do the recommendations. They were to help us write the specifications to get a vendor to implement the plan that they came up and recommended, and they were to help us monitor the performance of the contractor for the second phase, the implementation. So all this was realized, and in 1999 we did a procurement to get a vendor for a procurement that didn't happen until October of 2000. So they were in place more than a year, almost a year and a half, before we even did a procurement to get the second phase vendor. And they actually were part of the decision as discussed in planning, where it was decided not to even go forward and do the major project at all. But this is just an example that they need to have to know that we had to have a procurement to get a vendor to do effort to then go and supposedly do a second stage of the actual project. So you need to plan this, you need to know this so you can do this. All right, now we're going to say it differently. The elements of contract management. And shorthand, detection, documentation, decisive action equals deterrence. And I'm going to repeat that. Detection, documentation, decisive action equals deterrence. Now let me tell you what that means. Detection, and this is hopefully very obvious. You have to know whether the vendor is performing. You have to be able to detect performance versus non-performance. You will use the monitoring tools that we have described, whatever tool you think is appropriate, but they will be your methodology for determining if the vendor is performing. And as we said, it could be audits, reports, meetings, evaluations, observations, complaints. One or more of those are going to tell you if there is performance or the lack of performance. So you're going to detect what is happening. Key is it isn't good enough to simply know that something is or isn't happening. You have to document it, because the reality is if you don't document it, it's the same as if you didn't do anything. And I have been before the Board of Contract Appeals on claims from vendors where the vendor wants more money. because they say that they're doing something beyond what the contract said, or we've been going after them for money because they haven't been performing. And I have had situations where, okay, let's see what is in the file in terms of your documentation of the vendor's performance. And I can remember one particular situation where the vendor wanted a lot of money and claimed that he was doing actually about 20% more work than what the contract called for. And so I had, on one hand, I had a vendor wanting more money because they were doing work exceeding the contract. On the other hand, I had a facility manager who said the vendor was the worst vendor he had ever met, doing a lousy job, should be lucky to be paid a cent, let alone be paid more money, because it didn't matter whether he was doing more work or not more work, because he wasn't doing the work to begin with and basically shouldn't be paid. And I said, okay, show me the documentation. Show me what, in this case, they had a contract manager and they had, I think, monthly surveys of performance. And there were a couple years worth of documented performance, and every single survey said the vendor was doing either a good or a fair job. There was nothing in the file that said the vendor was subpar, doing anything other than what they were supposed to do. And basically what I'm left with is, how do I go and tell the vendor that he's not entitled to more money if there's nothing here that says there's any problem with the contractor's performance? Documentation is key. You go to your assistant attorney general, whether it's termination of a contract, whether it is withholding of payment under a contract, whatever the situation is, and if you involve your attorney, the first thing they're going to say is, show me the documentation. And if you can't either show documentation, or if you show documentation that's counter to what you're claiming, you're probably not going to go any further than right there. And it doesn't make any difference if you swear up and down, well, we just didn't document properly. The only thing that's going to matter if it goes to the Board of Contract Appeals is what is in the written documents. If they're not there, forget it. So, the contract manager has to make a written record of what she knows. There needs to be proof of non-performance if there is a contract claim, or especially if ultimately the contract is terminated for default. But documentation, and this is crucial as well, doesn't just mean the agency maintains it in your file. It isn't good enough. It is necessary, but it's what's called necessary but not sufficient. It isn't enough for it merely to be in your file. You need to go the next step. It is crucial that performance documentation be shared with the contractor. The contractor has to know that you are saying it is not performing. Because if you have all kinds of documentation that shows they're not performing, but you've never told the vendor, you're not going to win any action either. Because if they're not told anything contrary, what are they supposed to know other than what they're told? And you may say, well, they should know whether they're doing the job. And they should know whether they're doing the job. But the reality is they need to know whether you know they're doing the job. And the other thing you want is, if you provide documentation to the vendor, you want them to acknowledge that they have received that documentation. That doesn't mean they necessarily agree with it, because as we're going to say later, they can give you a rebuttal to your documentation, but you have to have some evidence they at least received it. And if they agree with it, you want them to sign they agreed with it. If they don't agree with it, you allow them to give you a rebuttal, and all of this will be kept in your contract management file. So you need to document. It might be assumed that since a contractor is preparing reports, attending meetings, etc., that it isn't necessary to tell a contractor what it already is supposed to know. But even if a contractor does know the degree to which it is or is not performing under a contract, it needs to be told that you know that if there are performance problems and expectation for remedial action. The old subject of, if I know but don't say anything, then I am by default letting you get away with it. So you need to let them know you know, and that something's going to happen. If reports, etc., show a lack of performance, but you say nothing, it may communicate that no one in the agency is reading the reports. And I've had this lots of times. I've had solicitations where I'm reviewing solicitations, and there'll be requirements for certain reports, and I'll be talking to the program people and I'll say, okay, what do you do with these reports? And sometimes I'll get people to tell me exactly what they do with the report and how they use it, etc. And sometimes I'll get people that say, I don't know, it was in the specifications, the contract before this, and I just used the same specs. I don't know who gets that report. I don't know if anyone looks at it. Well, then you don't need a report if no one has a purpose for it or no one looks at it. So just because they're giving something, if no one actively is looking at these things, it doesn't make any difference. And if no one comes back to them and says anything about their reports, it's the same as if you're letting them get away with non-performance. So it may mean no one reads the reports, no one cares, no one is prepared to do anything about it. And I will tell you something very shortly, have a little situation of no one prepared to do anything about it. Silence about non-performance early in the contract may complicate efforts to obtain compliance later. This whole situation, you need to set the stage properly to begin with, that you expect the contractor to do what they're supposed to do. And if you start off on the wrong foot, it makes it more difficult to turn things around later. So you need to do it properly to begin with. For instance, a contractor may claim that the lack of objection was approval, that you were agreeing with them. If they come to you later and say that they had a differing interpretation of the contract, your lack of saying anything about their performance may mean that you, at least they will claim that you agreed with them, that the contract said what they said it said, not what you said it said. Or it may mean a waiver by the state of a requirement. So these are things that can cause problems later, and we will talk about these things. We have 5 days. We'll talk about a lot of stuff in 5 days.
Some of you are thinking, I didn't start, or I just took over a contract that wasn't properly managed, or I had a contract and I've been busy with so many other things, and it just all of a sudden, people have been telling me about some problems with the vendor. It is not too late to start documenting, sending things to the contractor. It's great if you can do it right from the beginning. That should be our goal. But if you're in the middle of a contract and you've got some challenges, don't ignore them. Get on them now. If you need help, ask for it. I don't want you to think that this is only at the beginning. It is, because I'm seeing some concerns out there. You can start documenting now.
Yes. One of the slides earlier this morning was, you don't just throw up your hands and say there's nothing I can do about it. You will always try to, at that point in time, get the best you can under the circumstances. So it's always better to start, it's best to start in advance, and that's why we're telling you this now, so that things can be structured to work properly in advance, but we're also going to tell you how to do things if they weren't structured properly or if things come up later. So we're going to deal with the whole gamut. Let's see. Decisive action. Once a lack of performance is known and documented to both parties, do something about it. The vendor has to be told there are negative consequences if the situation isn't resolved. The vendor has to believe. They have to believe something bad is going to happen. Because if you don't believe it, you're not going to change action. So that's where you have to convince them. You have to take the action so they now start believing you that if they don't do proper performance, something's going to happen that they're not going to like. At the very least, they're not going to get paid, and maybe other actions. It's no good to be a paper tagger, et cetera, all bluff and no action. And what I am submitting is if you do these first 3 steps, that if you detect, if you document, if you take action, that becomes deterrence. That becomes when vendors start believing that you're going to do these things, then they're not going to start testing you, or they're going to stop testing you. They're going to believe that they have to properly perform, and that's more than half of the battle. If they believe they have to do it, and they start off to begin with believing they have to do it, it's easier to manage contracts with vendors that believe they have to actually properly perform. So a reputation gets around, perception is reality, and what I call a process of natural selection, that once you establish a reputation for requiring good performance, vendors will expect to provide good performance when they compete for your contracts. So to a degree, vendors that don't have those expectations of properly performing, the ones that want to do minimal work, the ones that want to get change orders all the time to get paid for other things, if they know they can't get away with it, they're either going to stop competing or they're going to change the way in which they do compete, and they're going to figure, I have to price to do the full job, because if I don't, I'm going to get nailed for it. So if you start with vendors that only intend to perform, it's easier to get vendors who will perform. So to a degree, poor vendors will stop responding or will now respond with the intent to perform, if you do the work to get the reputation that that's what you expect. And conversely, good vendors, and I've had situations in the past. I've had situations like Mark has said that he had a vendor who stopped competing because of a particular state contract manager. I've had vendors who stopped competing, and when I've asked them why don't they compete for our contracts anymore, they say, what's the point? I never win because I give a good price to do the work, and it always goes to the low bidder who everybody knows they're not going to do the job. They're pricing it, they know their price is too low, I know their price is too low, you know their price is too low, and so I'm not going to do a partial job, I'm going to price to do the entire job, and if you continually award to the vendor that's the cheapest without them having to really perform fully, I'm not going to win, no sense me even trying. And if you scare your good vendors away because of that scenario, you are going to be in nothing but problems with performance, because your vendors started and bid so that they're not going to perform properly. So a lot of this, you got to pay me now or pay me later type of situation. It's much easier to get good performance from vendors who intend to perform well, doing the hard work to prove that you demand good performance pays dividends in the future. No pain, no gain. Bite the bullet now for improvement later. All right. Now, when we did this one time before a class, I had someone that said, you really seem negative about vendors. You always seem to be talking as if vendors are always out to get the state. Isn't that kind of the wrong way to approach things? Shouldn't you be positive rather than always negative? And so this is my rebuttal to that particular comment at that particular time. The foregoing formula with an emphasis on deterrence seems to focus on the negative. It seems to assume that all contractors are inherently bad and must be pressured to properly perform contracts. Is this not a faulty approach? And my reply to what I call the happy face type of scenario is, although the aspects of the formula, the detection, documentation, decisive action equals deterrence, that's what I call the formula, seems to focus on the lack of respect and trust for contractors, other slides, as Mark said this morning, emphasize that you want to have and you should try to have a rapport with your contractors. Rapport is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. That contractors like to be part of a team. They like to provide valuable service to the public. So yes, that's a positive attribute. They might even do more than required by a contract. And I have had a situation, I have a particular, years ago here at the health department, I had a contract manager that always could get more out of a vendor than just what the contract called for, because that this person was so dynamic and had such passion about her job and unfailingly required the vendor to do everything required of the whole sum and substance of this person's interaction with the contractors. Inevitably, she got more than the contract called for from the vendors, and they were happy to do it because they had this rapport with her and they knew that she cared and it was a good thing. I'm not saying this is going to happen all the time. Most of the time it doesn't, but it can happen, and it's been emphasized. We said that people live up to expectations and might be motivated by praise and letters of commendation, things of this nature. Those are positives. But another slide, caution not to be naive. So you have both sides. You have the possibility that things are going to work out well, and you have the possibility that things are not going to work out well. The possibility of writing here and possibility of not writing here. But don't be naive about whether contractors will properly perform with little or no oversight. In reality, both approaches are needed. You need to be prepared to do whatever is necessary. If being the nice guy gets you better, more results, be the nice guy, as long as the contractor is performing. If being a nice guy doesn't get results, then don't be the nice guy. You should start out being relatively rigid in terms of monitoring until and unless you learn that a particular contractor does fine with a light management style. In other words, you adapt your management style to how you're getting along with a particular vendor, how they're adapting to you, how they're doing their job. If you always have to fight them, then you have to fight them. If you overcome the hurdle of doing the hard stuff first and they learn their lesson and start doing it, then you can back off a bit. Because we always said you need the rapport, you need to work things out on a day-to-day basis, that you can't always be the guy that no one wants to deal with anymore. So I'm going to, bless you, some common sayings that hopefully will reinforce what we're talking about. Hope for the best, plan for the worst. Better safe than sorry. Trust but verify. A verbal agreement isn't worth the paper it's printed on. And you need to stop and think about that a moment. And you say, huh? And that's right, it's a huh. That if it isn't in paper, it isn't. If it isn't documented, for instance. And I like the next one. Boilerplate language is unnecessary verbiage until it isn't. It's all just words, and a lot of people complain about these 30 or so mandatory clauses. And supposedly no one understands them, although some people do. And it's always the problem with vendors, and always a problem with program people who don't understand them. And do we really need all these things? And the answer is no, we don't need these things until there's a situation where we need them. And then we need them. And you're not going to know when your situation is. That's why these are mandatory clauses that have to be there for protection for the state. What gets measured gets done, forewarned is forearmed. So these are the themes that we're looking at when we talk about contract management and how you have to structure it to try to apply these things, and you hope for the best. If you don't have the best, you're prepared for the worst. Like many other things in life, properly managing contracts is an acquired skill. It is an acquired skill. It doesn't come readily to most people. Excuse me. It's acquired through training, common sense, conscientious effort, experience. All of these things come into play with managing contracts, as they do for anything in life. Training. You can take this class. I mean, what more can you ever have in instruction than this class?
Amen.
I have an amen. Do we hear others? We take lots of people saying fine. There's the Project Management Institute, there's the National Institute of Governmental Purchasing, there's all kind of classes out there on contract management, project management, etc. You can take classes on how to do this. Common sense. Don't discount common sense. How you treat people. Applying the same tact, diplomacy, courtesy, respect, etc. that you would use with your fellow employees, that people you encounter on the street, your friends and family, etc. Mark said that he brought up a contract manager who did not apply common sense in these traits, and a vendor walked away because of it. So you need to have some interpersonal skills. People don't like being beat on the head all the time unnecessarily. Conscientious effort. Great things can be accomplished with a little hard work. Contract management can be hard work. There's no question about it. Most things that you're doing in your job is work. That's why you're doing it. That's why it's called work. If it were fun, it wouldn't be called work. It would be called play. And the old axiom that has been said a number of times in these classes, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. I shouldn't repeat the same mistake twice. Once I found out something is going to be a problem, the next time I shouldn't let it be a problem. And experience. You cannot, nothing substitutes for experience. And a couple things, these are things that I have liked over the years as to statements about experience and experts and things like that. Good judgment comes from experience. Experience comes from bad judgment. Believe me, the things you learn the most are the things that went wrong, and you say to yourself, I'm never going to be in that situation again. So having done it once, I'm not going to put myself in that situation again. So I have experienced what it's like on the downside. Now I want to experience the upside. And comment?
Obviously, you don't have to try arsenic to know what it's going to do to you. By the same token, you don't have to have all the failures that give you experience. One of the interesting things that you could do is to read the Board of Contract Appeals decisions. They're all online. They're given out in some of the classes, and that will tell you concisely what went wrong either in the procurement process or in the monitoring of it, why the contract either failed or why there was a protest. But you'll learn a lot by picking people's brains, observing, and not necessarily thinking you got to make mistakes. But when you do, I agree, that's going to have the most impact upon the individual.
Yeah, you never try to make a mistake. That isn't an objective that you try for. But usually it finds us very frequently. I will plead guilty to the last point there. An expert is someone who has made all the mistakes. I've done it. Whatever it is that could go wrong, I've done it somewhere in my 35 years.
I've only read about half.
You've only read half of my mistakes? Well, I try not to publicize too many of my
You
mistakes.
still have time to do more.
I do. I'll probably make mistakes later today. Not by intent. All right, documentation. So here's an actual situation that hopefully will illustrate what I've just gone through of this issue of detection, documentation, decisive action equals deterrence. So this is, and for those of you who don't know, I've been with the state for a little over 35 years. More than 17 of those years were here at the Health Department. So I started off with 4 years at Department of Human Resources, 17 and a half years at Health and Mental Hygiene, and I've been at Budget Management for just about 14 years. So a lot of my examples when I was the guy on the scene, when I was the Gary Goldberg, happened here. And this is one of the ones that happened, I think, when I was first Chief of Procurement here at DHMH. This was about 1989. Human service contract. And it's, so it was a service for providers of people with mental illness. At the end of the contract period, the agency could have sole sourced a new contract to the incumbent due to continuity of care. If you do human service type contracts, you know you're allowed to do sole source for continuity of care, where it's necessary for the benefit of a client to continue with the same provider. So here was a situation where even though that was the normal thing that would happen, that almost all vendors were always continued as a sole source, in this instance, the agency did not want to continue with a particular vendor. They didn't want to do a sole source, so if you don't claim that it's sole source due to continuity of care, you have to do a competition. So they did a sealed proposal procurement. The incumbent, who was the one who was not continued under a sole source, complained. Well, you know, you have 50 other vendors that you're continuing through continuity of care. Why am I the one that you're going out on a procurement for? And I don't know what the agency told the vendor, but despite the vendor complaining, they went ahead and did a procurement. They didn't select the incumbent. Okay, moving along. The incumbent filed a bid protest. You're biased against me. Everything you've done to this point indicates you are biased. You, instead of doing a sole source, you did a procurement, and then you did a procurement, and you didn't pick me. you're biased. During the investigation to respond to the protest, and I was the procurement officer, so I had to respond to the protest, and this is where I learned the rest of the story, so to speak, the Paul Harvey type scenario. What I learned was that I learned why the program did what they did. I was told that the program administrator for this program had taken the only van for the program and had taken it to New York for 2 days on personal business, which meant the clients of the program had no way to get to their day programs, etc. So that was one situation that had happened. There was very strong suspicion the vendor was using program funds for his own use, that it wasn't going into the program, it was going into his pockets. And there were 2 separate documented instances where female clients had complained because the administrator used his key to enter their apartment unannounced, unchaperoned, at times in the morning when there was likely that they would be showering, etc., and they come out of the shower and there he is. So there were 2 instances of this. The bottom one is the key. Even though I was told as procurement officer in dealing with this protest that these 3 circumstances were known, I was also told that no one had ever told the administrator of this program that they knew any of these 3 things had happened or were alleged to have happened. The program was small and was founded and run by this administrator, so you couldn't just say take the administrator out of the equation because you couldn't separate the program from the individual who founded the program. And this was still when I was very young and naive as a procurement officer. So I did something that I wouldn't do today. Rather than confront the administrator with the described information, the state agency thought it was easier to put the program out for competition with the intent to not select the vendor for the new award. None of this was known by the procurement officer prior to preparing the protest response. Before I did the response, I didn't know any of this happened. I didn't know this is why they had done the procurement. Now, I would have asked, these days, I would have asked, why are you doing this? Because now I know more than I knew back in 1889. I definitely know more than 1889. Denied the protest. And this is another thing I wouldn't do again. It was decided by the agency and the assistant AG at that time in the protest denial not to put any of this information I just said to you. So the vendor still does not know, even with the protest denial, that we had any of this information. And I didn't insist otherwise. I was just new. I was going along with what the lawyer told me to do and what the agency wanted. And the vendor appealed the protest to the Board of Contract Appeals. So we're now going to get into potentially a protracted situation of fighting this situation. But now with the appeal, I have to do a response to the appeal. And in the response to the appeal, for the first time, I included this information. And immediately, the vendor withdrew its appeal. He immediately withdrew his appeal. Once he saw that we had this rationale, he did not want to go into a court situation, have this on record, have testimony, the whole bit. He immediately withdrew his appeal. So what this means is, while the agency detected and documented, they knew what happened, they documented what happened, the described circumstances, the administrator was never informed any of this was known, they never took any action, and so nothing was done to deter the administrator from doing what he was doing, simply because he didn't know anyone knew what he was doing. So if no one knows if I can get away with it, I'm going to keep doing what I can get away with. A lot of extra work was done in this situation trying to avoid confronting the issues, but in the end, usually it comes down to a confrontation, and usually sooner is better than later. Also, and this is another fact of life, you should not undertake a procurement with the intent to not award to a vendor. That is not supposed to be an intent of a procurement. Now, it may be that you don't award to a vendor from other circumstances, but we don't want to hear that you specifically went into that procurement with the intended result that you will not end up with vendor A, because that could be evidence of bias. And if a vendor can prove bias, a vendor is going to win. The intent not to award to a specific vendor could be evidence of bias if this intent was revealed during a hearing about the appeal. If we would have gone on to the appeal and they'd have put someone on the stand and then someone would have said, yeah, we didn't want them from day one, they could have won their case right there. Although that probably would not be the case due to these specific circumstances. These circumstances may have been sufficient to evidence that, but we never should have gotten to this point. This illustrates why contract managers need to involve the procurement officer at appropriate times so that an informed, collective, reasoned response can be devised. You are not out there on your own as a contract manager. There are things you are expected to do, and there's things you are not permitted to do. You cannot do anything and everything. You cannot terminate contracts. You cannot do modifications. You cannot exercise options. You need to involve the procurement officer. So you need to have this continuing dialogue so the procurement officer knows what's going on and can advise you of what to do at any point in time and can determine when to get the assistant AG involved. So you need to have this continual collaboration between your contract manager and your procurement officer. Now that doesn't mean every day you go to the procurement officer and tell him or her everything that's going on, but it just means you have to know when you need to involve the procurement officer. And doing so at the right time saves problems later. Moreover, since the procurement was conducted by sealed proposal, the vendor should have been informed of these circumstances even during the evaluation. Shouldn't have just been not selected. They should have been, if this was really conducted properly, those circumstances, even if they wouldn't have been told to the vendor while the contract management was in effect, should have been mentioned in the evaluation stage. So the vendor could have either rebutted them or withdrawn their proposal at that time or whatever. But you always are supposed to let vendors know negative circumstances that may lead to their non-selection in an evaluated procurement. It is unlikely it could have successfully done anything in this situation given those three, but maybe it could have. Maybe it could have said, no, I did make arrangements for someone else to take the people to the day program. I was surprised as anyone else when I came back and found out they didn't do it. Or maybe he could have proven that he was not diverting funds. Or maybe he would have had a rebuttal for the other circumstance. But you need to let the person have the opportunity to have their say. But if informed of the knowledge of these issues before the procurement was done, it may never have submitted a proposal at all. So if the vendor knew even before a procurement was done that these circumstances were known, it might have saved itself the effort of doing a proposal. A lot of things that could have saved time and effort if the right information was conveyed at the right time. Now for the details. I don't think we want to start at the details at 5 till 12, so why don't we come back at 1 o'clock.